Dr. Lamar Hardwick is a father, husband, pastor, and author with deep commitment to serving others. He holds a Master of Divinity from Emory University and a Doctor of Ministry from Liberty University School of Divinity. He has also been recognized as a graduate of the Yale School of Divinity Clergy Scholar Program and Georgia Forward's prestigious Young Gamechangers program, which brought together 50 of Georgia's brightest minds and leaders under the age of 40. Currently pursuing his PhD at Union Institute and University in Cincinnati, Ohio, Dr. Hardwick continues to lead with wisdom and grace. Diagnosed with Autism Spectrum Disorder at the age of 36, Dr. Hardwick has embraced this part of his journey, becoming a passionate advocate for those with disabilities in our faith communities. His work, including the award-winning book, Disability and the Church, A Vision for Diversity and Inclusion, has provided an essential roadmap for how the church can better serve and embrace those with disabilities. Please welcome Dr. Lamar Hardwick to the NCMS stage.
Well, good. Is it morning? No? Good morning-ish. I'm from Georgia, so I'm like 2 hours ahead. So I'm still trying to figure out like what time is it actually. But so I wanna talk a lot about the work that I do, with the understanding that there is a huge overlap in the work that I do and the work that gaming culture, nerd culture does. So I want to start with, go ahead and go to the next slide. Just a few things about me. Now this picture is a couple years old, so everybody in that picture is now taller than me except my wife. So like those are our three kids and they're all like super tall now, and it's very disturbing. But that's just a little bit about me. And you heard in the video, at age 36, I was diagnosed myself on the autism spectrum, so I'm one of those people who are considered a late diagnosis. Although around 7 or 8, I tell people I knew that there were significant differences between me and my peers. Like I pretended to understand a lot of things, I just didn't get people. One of the things that I say is, and this is probably true of nerd culture, right? I felt like I was in a world that was in on an inside joke that I didn't get. And so I was always on the outside trying to figure out what these kids were talking about, and people were just weird. Like they would say I was weird and I would say, no, you're weird. Like at the heart, I'm a storyteller, so I want to start with a story that sort of frames our time together. There's a story of a woman who fell ill, and unfortunately she died, and so she goes to heaven. Now when she gets there, Peter's at the gate. I don't get this, but every heaven story you've ever heard, Peter's always at the gate, right? I don't understand, like maybe he just got assigned to gate duty because he was in trouble, I don't know. But Peter's at the gate, and so she sees her family and friends waving her in, and it looks like there's a party going on, and so she goes up to Peter and says, look, how do I get into this place? And Peter says, oh, it's easy. All you have to do is spell one little word. And she says, well, what's the word? And he says, love. She says, that's easy, L-O-V-E. Peter says, hey, welcome to heaven. Your family and friends are here. Enjoy Jesus for eternity. Well, a couple years pass, and she runs into Peter, and Peter looks really frantic, and so he grabs her and says, hey, can you do me a favor? Can you watch the gate? The Lord really has me busy today doing other things. Can you watch the gate? She says, oh, yeah, no problem. He says, now remember, if anyone shows up at the gate, have them spell the word. She says, love. He says, you got it. Just go ahead and handle that for me. I really appreciate it. Well, after about a couple hours of standing there, her husband shows up at the gate. Some of you are looking like, yeah, this is not going to go well. And so he sees his family and friends. It looks like there's a party going on in heaven. And she sees her husband. She says, oh, my God, it is so good to see you. Before I let you in, tell me what were some of the things that happened on earth after I died? And he was real quiet. He didn't want to answer. And he says, well, you're not going to like this, but you know how you and your sister look exactly alike? well, after you died, I missed you so much. So 6 months after you died, I married your sister. And she leans back and says, oh, really? What else happened after I died? He says, you're not going to like this either, but 6 months after I married your sister, we played the lottery and hit, and we won $150 million. And she says, oh, really? He sees his family and friends waving him in. He's like, enough about me. How do I get into this place? She said, oh, it is simple. All you got to do is spell one little word. He says, well, what's the word? She says, Czechoslovakia. That was kind of a test to see. I like you guys. Now, it's a funny story, but the reason I say that, and I share that story often, is because, you know, whether you're a believer or not, heaven is sort of a cultural placeholder for the ideal, right? We even use it as an adjective. This, you know, we talking about how beautiful it is. It's heavenly, right? Or this ice cream was, like, we use it as a placeholder. And a lot of what I'm going to say today, I'm going to talk about disabilities. But in the end, it's about understanding that in our culture, and Christianity has had a lot to do with this, we have crafted the ideals about what it is to be normal, what it is to be human, what it is to be acceptable. And there's a lot of overlap between the work that I do with people with disabilities and the work that is done in gaming and nerd culture, because we are, in effect, fighting against this ideal that's been crafted about what it means to be human, what it means to be normal, what it means to be a part of community. And oftentimes, whether we realize it or not, Christianity has had a say in how those things were crafted. So this is about learning how to fight against some of these ideals and to create a culture of inclusion. But I want to get us on the same page. So next slide, please. So I want to talk about the great banquet. And we know this in Luke 14, and we'll get there. Some of you I know are good church people. And so I often say when I preach, people say you're not preaching until you get to the scripture. We're going to get there. But I want us to get on the same page, because for some of you, this may be new information about disabilities. As a matter of fact, some of you may not know this, but that the latest data, and I think it's actually increases, that 1 in 4 people in the world have some form of a disability. And it's also 1 in 4 in the United States. I think that number has increased since COVID, because long COVID has started to surface and people are having challenges that they didn't have before, cognitive challenges, breathing challenges. I myself am actually being treated for stage 4 cancer. And so I have some physical disabilities that I didn't have. 2020 was a whopper of a year. COVID hit, and then the fall of that, I was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. I had a year of remission. It came back, and now I am being treated for stage 4, which we found out over a year ago is inoperable. And so I share that to say, because I like people to know what I'm up against so they can see what God is up to. And so a lot of my work has actually increased, because now I have not just a developmental disability in autism, but I have physical disabilities that I didn't have before 2020. And so go ahead to the next slide. I want us to get an understanding of this so that we can get on the same page before I talk about what it's like to set the table. So disability is often associated with medical or health conditions, physical impairments or limitations, mental or emotional. Oftentimes we classify disability as a physical, developmental, or intellectual disability. And disability is a vastly wide term. So when I say that, it can mean a lot of things. And we don't have time to sort of break it down, but just know that we're using it as an umbrella for what's typically known as a disability. And I should say this as far as language. I use disability, and you hear me say it a lot. As a matter of fact, online I'm known as the autism pastor, and I tell people I actually didn't come up with that. A woman who I was working with very early in my work, when I disclosed my diagnosis publicly, said, you are like the pastor for the autism community, because many of us don't get to go to church. And so before Zoom was cool, I was actually using it to meet with families and pray with them and do all sorts of things. Actually, I was using Skype, and then Zoom just kind of took over, and I don't even know, did Skype even exist anymore? Like, they just, but before video conferencing was cool. And so you think about disability, it's about health independence and engagement in society. And it can vary depending on a few factors. Next slide. It can depend like the severity of the impairment, actually social, political, and cultural influences and expectations. Usually those are what it means to be normal, to have a normal body. The aspects of natural and built surroundings actually influence how we understand disability, availability of assistive technology, and family and community support and engagement all sort of shape how we understand disability. Next slide, please. Now there's two models that I usually deal with, and this is not all of the models, but I want us to get a firm understanding because it plays a significant part in how we do ministry in my world, but also in how we potentially do ministry in this world. And that is, one, the medical model. The medical model basically says that disability is a biomedical issue alone, that there is something wrong with this person's body, and so it tends to focus on causes and cures. How do we figure out what caused this? How do we get rid of it so that other people are not born with this? And how do we cure it, right? And Christians, I gotta say this, like we are, for the most part, obsessed with causes and cures, right? We're always looking at, original sin. This is what caused, this is why we're all screwed up, right? And then we want cures, like how do we get rid of this? What is the conclusion of this? I think those are very important things, but what I found in studying Jesus and trying to set tables for people with disabilities and people who are different is that Jesus is also very concerned not just with causes and cures, but with quality of life. How do we as Christians, how do we as the church help improve the quality of life of people who are on the margins and not just try to find ways to fix them? And that's what my ministry is all about, because a lot of times when we think about disability, it is what caused this and how can we stop it and how can we cure it. And there's very little attention paid to how can we improve the quality of that person's life by being a community for them. So the medical model says, hey, let's figure out how to fix people. There's something wrong with your body, there's something wrong with your mind, you're weird, you are not like us, and in order for you to be a part of our community, we need to find a way to make you like us. That's the medical model. There's another model called the social model, and it departs significantly from the medical model because it pays acute attention to society and the ways in which it socializes people who have disabilities, and I'm going to substitute the term socializes people who are different. That's the ideals I talked about just a few minutes ago. And the social model of disability doesn't view disability simply as an impairment that needs to be managed or fixed, but it looks at a complex understanding of the ways in which society's narratives about disability, or I'll say even difference, are oftentimes more disabling than the actual impairment itself. What do you mean? For people who have, and I now have mobility challenges because the chemo, my first time around, destroyed my feet. And I'm so glad, maybe my friend is up here. Jeff found me yesterday struggling to get up to the hill. And he said, do you want to ride? In the golf cart, I said yes, because the chemo destroyed my feet. I have extreme neuropathy. It is difficult for me to walk long distances. But people with mobility issues, maybe they're wheelchair users, will find that oftentimes if we as society actually create environments that give them the same access we have, then the fact that they have mobility issues is not as challenging as the fact that we have actually created a world that's not built for them. You following me? So the social model says sometimes it's the way that we treat people with disabilities or difference that's actually more disabling than what the actual impairment is. And if we figure out a way to be more accommodating and more inclusive, then the disability or the difference that they have is actually not as much of an impairment as we have made it out to be. Next slide, please. So the social model advocates for the participation of society in the ridding of disabling structures. And I'll add the structures that actually keep people who are different out from community. And because of the primary perspective in this model of social, the issue at hand is a robust examination and critique of cultural and ideological understanding of issues such as impairment, chronic pain, suffering, and body image. And can I say, I love the church. I've pastored for over 20 years. I recently retired because of the rigor of the treatment that I'm in, but I love the church. And so sometimes I critique the church because I love the church. And we don't do very well with those things I just mentioned. Understanding impairment, chronic pain, suffering, body image, disability. And so I frame it this way. The question theologically then for us is, what does it mean to be human? And for many years, and I've done a lot of research on this. He mentioned I'm doing another doctorate, PhD in ethics, which is sort of my stamp for I'm really like I'm a for real nerd. Like I just stay in school all the time. I am a glutton for punishment. But a large part of that is because I want to do some work on not just helping the church, but helping policies and the things that further disenfranchise people with disabilities. But I say this to say we have to think about what does it mean to be human. And for a long time in the history of the church, a lot of the position that we have taken to help form some of those ideals and some of those images of what it meant to be human is that we have lifted up an ideal or lifted up an image that to be able-bodied and independent is the apex of the human experience. Which, if you read scripture, nothing can be further from the truth. We were never created to be independent. We were created to be interdependent. And a large part of how we socialize with people with disabilities or difference is that we measure their worth by their ability to be ruggedly independent. And if you're not, there's something wrong with you. You are weird. You're not a part of our community because you don't meet this superficial ideal or standard that we've created, and in some cases have worshiped as being the apex of the human experience. I don't believe, and we'll get to this, I don't believe that that's what Jesus teaches us. Next slide. So understanding disability and difference is that there's a challenge of being disabled or different is a challenge that requires whole-scale societal and environmental changes. The management of disability or difference is a social responsibility. How we handle people who are different is a social responsibility. It is not just left up to medicine to say, these people are different, they have different bodies, they have different minds, here, fix them, and when they're fixed, they can be a part of us. So it has to be then seen as an issue of human dignity and human rights. And for churches and faith communities and faith-based organizations, this means including disability and difference in our discussions about diversity and justice, which, if I can give sort of a overarching definition of that is that God expects us to use our resources to, as best as we can, level the playing field. So for the church, then, it becomes the issue of justice for people who are disabled or people who are different. How are we trying to level the playing field so that they are included without having to feel like their bodies and their minds have to be fixed before they can be a part of our communities? How can we love them just as they are? Next slide. So then understanding disability is about understanding difference. And this is why I say there's overlap here. That the work that I do and the work that the gaming community and the nerd community do there's lots of overlap. In fact, I was saying at the table that one of the things that actually accelerated the overlap was COVID, because you found a lot of churches, and I was very critical of this because, again, I love the church, and I even critique my own church. When accessibility became an issue for able-bodied people, churches got real creative on how they found a way to give access to people to their services. All of a sudden, we found money to stream, to have services online, and to do all sort of creative things to help able-bodied people have access. And it benefited people with disabilities, people who were already outside of the community, but the intention was not for that community. And what I love is that the gaming community had already been teaching us how to use streaming, and not just offering services, but how to build digital spaces where real community was happening, and acknowledging that digital community is real community. That it's not just, oh, we just watch services. And so, you know, when I was asked to come, I'm like, I love what you're doing, because I get it. I have been on the other side of this, trying to push the church, because there are a lot of pastors, once COVID sort of waned, said, let's get rid of streaming because we want butts in the seats, and people are not coming. And what I advocated for, and you can find where I rebutted a lot of articles from a lot of famous pastors and got myself in trouble. You know, part of being on the spectrum is we just say whatever we think. We don't, like, there's, people are like, weren't you scared to say that? I'm like, I didn't know I was supposed to be scared. Like, that's just not how my brain works. It's like, I guess I probably should have thought about that, but you know, the truth is the truth, right? But it was me advocating for, no, this is real community. And we need to continue to do this, because we are now giving access to people who have long been wanting access. And it was actually sort of a telling season, because people with disabilities were saying, you could have done this all along. You're doing this because able-bodied people can't come to church. So when we think about this, it's about understanding difference and diversity. And diversity is all about intentionally including all people who are different or marginalized. So as I'm moving into the story of the Great Banquet, here's what I want us to sort of know and to center on it, that the banquet is most beautiful when different bodies and minds are invited to the table. I'm going to say that again, because I'm a preacher. The banquet is most beautiful when different bodies and minds are invited to the table. So let's go to some scripture, because you're going to say I didn't preach unless I read the scripture. This is Luke 14. Most of you, all of us should know this. You're all good Christians, so I'm not teaching you anything that you don't already know, right? It says, when Jesus noticed that all who had come to the dinner were trying to sit in the seats of honor near the head of the table, he gave them this advice. When you're invited to a wedding feast, don't sit in the seat of honor. What if someone who is more distinguished than you has also been invited? The host will come and say, give this person your seat, then you will be embarrassed. I love Jesus. And you will have to take whatever seat is left at the foot of the table. I like to describe this, because we're coming up on Thanksgiving, as you're coming home and you're sitting at the adult table and your parents come and tell you to go sit at the kids' table. Like, we've all had that happen, right? You're in college and you're like, I'm 19, I'm grown, I'm sitting at the, and then they make you sit at the card table that has the Kool-Aid stains, and you're sitting there with your 8-year-old niece who's picking her nose. And this is what Jesus is saying. When the banquet is done, don't assume that the seat of honor belongs to you. I want you to hold on to that thought. He says, because you don't want to be embarrassed when the host comes in and says, that's not really your place. Instead, take the lowest place at the foot of the table, and then when the host sees you, he will come and say, friend, we have a better place for you. Then you will be honored in front of all the guests. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled. How many of us have lived that? And those who humble themselves will be exalted. Next slide. Then he turned to his host. When you put on a luncheon or a banquet, this is important. He says, don't invite your friends, brothers, relatives, and rich neighbors, for they will invite you back, and that will be your only reward. So if you think about Jesus saying, this is how we build the table, this is how we build the church, I'm going to say something very stern. Stop building our churches with the people that we think can pay for it. I'm just going to let that marinate like a good steak. This is what Jesus is saying. He says your only reward is that you will only see the people who you thought could finance your ministry or your church or your organization, because those are the only people that you focused, and that's your only reward. That's as far as it's going to get. He says, instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Then at the resurrection of the righteous, God will reward you for inviting those who could not repay you. Here's what I've said to pastors, and again, I get in a lot of trouble. But I've said this to pastors: you think your church is blessed. But what Jesus says is that if you focus on people with disabilities and those who are different, those who are marginalized, those who society has pushed off into the margins, if you invite them first and make them your priority, then God is on the hook for the payment. And I would rather God be responsible for financing the building of this table than the few able-bodied, ideal image people that we have assumed are the apex of the human experience to fund whatever it is that we're doing. He says God will reward you. I don't take that lightly. I trust that. So next slide. Here's what we learn from this banquet story. Number one, seats are a symbol of honor. Remember, he says don't come in and take the seat of honor because you might get embarrassed. Don't assume that the building of this table is done to prioritize you. The building of this banquet, Jesus says, is to prioritize the people who nobody is thinking about. And you don't want to be embarrassed when you go in and build this table and think that this is about us. This is about the able-bodied people or the ideal image people or the images that we've worshiped of what it means to be human and to be independent, and find out that this whole thing wasn't really about you at all. And so we also learn that they represent a power structure that exposes what we value and who determines that value. So you remember the story of the woman at the gate? Can I say this? One of the ways that we can begin to build an inclusive environment for those with disabilities, those who are different, those who are weird, those who are nerds, is to understand, watch this, that at some point in our life, self-included, we have operated as gatekeepers. And sometimes we create barriers to what we believe is the ideal because, like the woman, maybe we switched up the language, we moved the goal line, right? This is what it means to be human. This is what it means to be normal. This is what it means to be a member of this community. This is what it means to be Christian. And at some point, we all learn that maybe not for the entirety of our Christian life or our ministry, at some point, all of us have stood as gatekeepers and have been a barrier to people who are different from accessing this community. Here's what we also learned, that honor is the placing of weight. You learn that if you study Hebrew culture, right? It is to put weight on something, right? To say this deserves more. It's almost like if you've been to college, like if you ever had a weighted GPA or a weighted grade, you know that this is super important. This is what Jesus is saying about people who are disabled, people who are different, is that we have to honor them, put more weight on including them to the table. And I said this before, we also can kind of understand this if you do your homework, that the Western church has historically held this seat as it relates to defining value and importance. If we look back on the trajectory of the church, we will find that in a lot of ways, we have created images and idols of what it means to be a good church member, what it means to be a good Christian, what it means to be a part of this community. And a lot of times those images and idols don't include people who are disabled, people who are different, people who are nerds, people who game. And we have had a huge influence on why some of those images and idols continue to persist in our culture. And if we think about it, that's why there's a such thing as the margin. Because the further away you get from this image and idol, the more and more you don't belong. Next slide, please. So the framing of disability inclusion and the inclusion of different people as a matter of diversity and subsequently justice is a part of setting the table. And again, I use that word justice because that's a buzzword now, right? And so I have to go into churches and say, this is just as much a part of doing justice, right? And we know this, like Micah says this, what does our God require of us, right? To walk humbly, to love the Lord, to do justice. I tell people, we might have some differences, of course, in our culture. People talk about the differences of justice. Is this justice, is that justice? But the one thing that we cannot deny is that the God of injustice does not exist. God calls us to use our resources and our influence to level the playing field as much as we possibly can. So setting the table also means intentional reseating or restructuring. You notice that Jesus says, that's not your seat. Get up. Let's reorganize this. Here's what I love. If you read the next part of that section, Jesus actually goes in to tell a story about a guy who's having, so it's kind of weird, right? Jesus is at a dinner party and he's talking to the people at the dinner party. Then he goes on to tell a story about a dinner party. You remember this? And he says that the guy tells the servant to go out and the people decline. And he says, go out and invite the lame, the blind, the crippled, the poor. And then the guy goes out and does that. And here's what I tell pastors. Then he comes back after he invited the blind, the lame, the crippled, the poor, the different, the weird, the nerd, everybody who's different. And he comes back and tells his master, there's still room for more. Wow. Here's what I tell pastors. The reason why it is so difficult, and I have so many pastor friends, some of them pastor mega churches, and whenever we talk theology, we talk mission, we talk a lot of things. It's so hard to get them to have a conversation about disability or difference. And what I tell them is, and I'm kind of getting ahead of my slides here, but we'll get here, is it's because we built the church backwards. The servant says, I went out and prioritized all the people who society's placed on the margins, and guess what? There's still room for more. Here's what I tell pastors. If you prioritize this community, which by the way is one of the largest mission fields, both the gaming and nerd community and the disability community, if you prioritize that group, there's always room to do everything else you want to do in your church. But you got to start there. You remember the illustration, we all heard this, of the philosophy professor who goes into class and puts a jar and he says, he puts the big rocks in, is this jar full? You remember this story? And everybody says yes. Then he puts in the pebbles. Is it full? Yeah, it looks pretty full. Then he puts in the sand and it kind of sifts down, and then he puts in the water. And the point is that he tells his class, if you put the important things in first, then you can put everything in first. And I say he stole that from Jesus. Right? Because this is what Jesus is saying. Start with this community and there's room to do everything else you want to do in your church. You're not going to miss anything. So the centering of the disabled and different voices is part of setting the table, and platforming disabled and different leaders. That's important. I always say you can tell an organization's commitment to diversity by who it allows to lead. If we want to set the table for people who are different, people who are disabled, part of that means giving them a seat of honor at the table that allows them to speak into the things that we may not be aware are barriers for them becoming a part of our community. One of the things that I did when I disclosed my diagnosis is it actually helped me find out that there are actually people in our church, some of them on my staff. At the time, I pastored a pretty large church for a small town, and I had a staff of 12, and I didn't know that some of them had disabilities. I had a staff member who had severe OCD. Sometimes was hospitalized for it. I had a staff member who had a severe anxiety disorder. I had a staff member who confessed she had lupus, and that's why some of the days that she was off is because she had a flare-up. Had elders who said, I have a daughter who's on the spectrum, and some of the people who we fuss about only come to church every 8 weeks, we found out the reason why. I like to say this, one of the things that we found out about David is when he went to fight Goliath, you remember this? He says, I've been fighting lions and bears. You remember that? And what I've often taught is that that's the first time that David has actually confessed that he's been fighting things in the background that nobody knew about. Wow. And it's the same for people with disabilities, with chronic illness, for people who are different. And I would train our church. We have people who we're trying to get to come through the doors who are fighting battles all week that you know nothing about. And the reason we need them at the table is so that they can help us to understand that these are some of the barriers that you created to us becoming a part of your community. These are some of the lions and bears we've been fighting, and if you want us to be a part of your community, here's how you can change things for the better so that we can be a part of this banquet that you're building. Next slide, please. So the inclusion, then if we talk about disability, diversity, and justice, inclusion is the intentional restructuring of society, right? We have a part to play in that. We're having a great conversation at our table, and I talk about some of the work, and I appreciate the conversation that you let us in on. And I was telling them I have a similar conversation with people in the disability community, because I don't know if many of us know this, the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, I think we just celebrated 30 years of that, and I was telling them at the table, most people don't know that churches and faith-based organizations are the only organizations that are exempt from having to legally accommodate people with disabilities. And the reason that is because they spent millions of dollars lobbying to say, we don't want to have to accommodate people with disabilities. And so the conversations that you have to have with people are the same conversations I have to have with the disability community, because we earned a bad reputation with them when we were willing to spend money to communicate that we didn't want them in our churches. That's the overlap that we have. We're having the same conversation because you're right, we earned that reputation. So that's why it's a part of helping to restructure society, social life, and culture. We owe it to the people who we have further disenfranchised. And I love the saying, it's not my fault, but it is my responsibility. I preached a sermon years ago from the book of Nehemiah and said that exact same thing, right? Nehemiah, he wasn't even born in Jerusalem. He had no idea what it looked like, but he said, you know what, it's not my fault, but it's going to be my responsibility to help rebuild it. So when we do this, it makes it possible for persons of all types to engage in the activities that are important and significant to their desired roles in participating in community with others. Notice the key overlap there, their desired roles. I'm a gamer, I'm a nerd, this is what I do. I want to continue to participate in your community in my desired role, right? And it's similar to people with disabilities, where we have to relinquish this need to try to change or fix them, either medically or whatever the case may be, in order for them to play a role in the community or the table that we're setting. Next slide, please. Now, the reason why this is important, if we want to talk practically, studies have shown that an increase in diversity actually increases group learning. Having people with disabilities, people with difference, people who are gamers, people who are nerds at the table actually increases group learning. our churches will become smarter, will become more engaged, will become better missionaries, better evangelists by inviting people who are different. It increases group learning. Now, this group, Bantle and Jackson, was doing that with organizations, but this is true, right? This is what Jesus says. Prioritize this group. Put them at the table first. You'll have room to do everything else you want to do. Diverse teams or organizations benefit from a wide range of resources, ideas, and experience. I can't tell you how much, we had this conversation at the table, I can't tell you how much it improved, and I pastored 2 churches after my diagnosis where I went in and did a lot of work to help the church become more disability inclusive, and I can't tell you how it just made the entire church better. Having better signage, teaching people. One of the things we talked about back there is that most churches have a part in their service, and it means a lot, right? Where in between songs, turn and greet your neighbor and hug them. And so I did it like a survey in both churches that I pastored. And I found out that about 80% of the people who were coming late, you know the people that we fuss about? They're always late. They only come when the preaching starts. You know what I found out? They were coming late to miss that part of the service. You know why? Because many of those people had social anxiety, which is something that I have. Some of them were OCD. They didn't like forced touch. There were a lot of things that we were doing that were forcing them to not participate in that part of the service. And while we were mad that they were coming late to preserve their mental health. But I didn't know that until I invited them to the table, gave them a seat of honor, and said, what are some of the barriers? And they said, that's why we come late, Pastor. It's not we're trying to be disrespectful. It is very hard. I'm like, I get that. I have social anxiety myself. The only reason I'm able to do church is because I'm the pastor. I know everything that's going to happen, right? So I kind of have an idea of like, okay, we're going to sing really loud for 12 minutes. And I put my headphones on and just deal with it. Non-diverse groups find it harder to keep learning because less and less unique information is being brought to the group. Dare I say, this is why a lot of our churches are dying. Because we're getting less and less unique information that helps us to keep our finger on the pulse of the people we say we're trying to, like it's only the church that, I shouldn't say only church, but this is what I do, so I'm critical sometimes. I found that we don't sometimes care about the very group, we don't care what the group that we're trying to reach thinks about us. If you go to a restaurant, they give you a receipt, how do we do? I was getting text messages in the back from my doctor's office. We want your feedback, right? It's only the church that would say, no, we do what we do, and we don't care what you think. And I think that's not something that Jesus taught. You remember Jesus sat around with his disciples and says, who do people say I am? I think we over-spiritualize that sometimes. I think he's just like, what's the word on the street? We got a little buzz, people following us on X, Instagram, hashtag fish and loaves. Right? We're doing our thing. What's the word on the street? What do people think about us? I talk about this in my book, Disability in the Church. One of the things that I had to come to grips with when I was processing my own diagnosis, I had to ask the question, what do people experience when they experience me? Because it wasn't what I thought it was. And then I had to go get help, and a clinical psychologist eventually diagnosed me and said, you're on the autism spectrum. But I said, that's a good spiritual question. What do people experience when they experience us? Because sometimes it's not what we think it is. Next slide, please. So I think I have a little bit of time, so I'm going to kind of speed through this. This is a great example of what it means to intentionally reseat. I'm going to just tell you, because you're good Christians and you read the Bible, to read this. This is from Galatians chapter 4, verse 12 through 16. I won't read it, but basically here's what Paul is saying. He's talking about how he landed in Galatia, and he talks about the fact that it was because he had a physical infirmity. And he later goes on to say, some of you were so kind that you would have given your eyes to me if you could, which is an indication that one of Paul's disabilities is that he had vision impairment, which is why he had a scribe. Some scholars think that that's what he's talking about in Corinthians. Others debate that, right? But we do know that Paul had a visual impairment because he said, y'all were so good to me that if you could, you would have given me your eyes. But then he goes on in this And you can go to the next slide. He actually asked the people in Galatia to put themselves in his shoes. So we talk about intentional reseating. I think the very best place to start is to try to find a way to put ourselves in the shoes of the people who have often been marginalized, if not by the church, but by society. What is it like to be you? What is it like for you to try to engage in our community? What is it like to you to try to fight for a seat at the table? How difficult is it for you? What are some of the barriers? What are some of the things that we're doing that we could change? And there's a lot of things that I go in and consult with churches, even my own church, that I told them, you're just gonna have to stop doing that. Oh, well, that's what we do. Well, if you want these people to come, stop doing that. Is it that important that you're willing to risk an entire mission field because you want to do things the way that you've always done it? So I want to wrap up with this. We talk about intentional reseating. Invitation is sharing space, right? That's inviting people. But inclusion is helping them to help us to shape the space. Give them a seat of honor, like Jesus says. Put some weight on the words that they share with us about their experience, and then we get to work. People with disabilities and difference live in a world that is not built for them. And their education and experiences are a necessity in shaping the spaces that we share. Next slide. Now here, and I put a lot of stuff on the slides so you can take a picture, but these are all scriptures that kind of help us to see how people with disabilities or differences are actually at the center of God's agenda. Next slide. A good story to lean on too as you're thinking about recalibrating is the story of Mephibosheth. I always like, why? Like if you're looking to name your child, that's a good name. Very strong biblical name. An invitation to the king's table was a sign of high honor, but here's what I love about that story is that it resulted in dignity and influence. It wasn't just inviting him to have a seat at the table, because if you read the story, 35 other people were employed as a result of him being given a place. So not only did it give him dignity, it gave him influence. This is what we want people with disabilities and difference to have in our churches. Next slide. So let me conclude with this. The banquet is built by inviting and including the disabled and the marginalized first. Jesus is very clear. Invite these people first, and I promise you, you'll have room to do everything else. And God says that he will reward or he will bless you. He will repay you. You don't have to worry about trying to build a church using people who we have said are the ideal bodies and minds, and they're the apex of the human experience. So these are the people we want to pay for our church. Jesus is the exact opposite. Here's what I say in my book, and I say this to people in person. The seats of honor have been stolen and we need to return them. We have prioritized the wrong group. We've sat in a seat that Jesus says doesn't belong to us. And in order for us to reach these communities, we need to vacate those seats and give them to the people who Jesus intended to have them. And I've said this before, we have built the church backwards. When disability, inclusion and difference, inclusion and belonging is a priority, there's always room for everything else. I promise you, you won't miss out on anything else if you prioritize the group that Jesus says to prioritize. Thank you.